Kia ora, everyone. Sorry, just a bunch of the waiting room is going crazy. High demand for our speaker today, who I'm about to
Mhm.
introduce. But I just want to welcome you all and thank you for your flexibility. Bev was not well, and she's up and at 'em today and feeling great. And I know there's a lot of excitement for her topic. So, on behalf of Kayathri and me and the rest of the network, we just want to welcome you all to today's conversation. And we're going to hear from um, Bev Tso Hong, whose topic is In Between the Boxes, Decolonizing Research Data from a Tangata Tiriti of Color Lens. Those of you who don't know Bev, she's a frequent supporter and contributor to the network, community and social policy researcher. Her current roles are with ethnic research as the ethnic researcher engagement lead at Community Research. Amongst a range of other roles, she has decades of experience in the field of research and evaluation, and we always benefit from hearing her thoughts. So, without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Bev. Kia ora, Bev.
So let us begin with a opening kia. Kia taunga manaakitanga e te mea ngaro. Ki runga ki tēnā o tātou. Kia mahia ti huamakihikihi. Kia toi te kupu, toi te mana, toi te araha, toi te reo Māori. Kia tūturu ka whakamawa kia tina. Huye, takia.
Taikie.
Let the strength and life force of our ancestors be with each and every one of us, freeing our path from obstruction so that our words, spiritual power, love and language are upheld, permanently fixed, established and understood. Forward together. So tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you everyone for coming along to this webinar, and I really appreciate your time. First, I'd just like to introduce myself. Ko Bev Tso Hong toka whenua, no Nam Tiong Bat Tong Guangzhou. Haina oku te puna. I whānau toku papa ki te Te Whanganui Atara, I whānau aho ki Hawara. Taiga hou, ngori hei, ngō tai gong hei yapbat, galo le Aotearoa, ngori hei puenyu, hei nido yigang se doila. No reira tēnā koutou katoa. So just, once again, welcome everyone, and thanks for your patience in terms of me being unwell. I'd like to thank Tim and Kayathri and the Aotearoa Migration Research Network. I'd just like to say I'm a tad terrified because I wasn't quite expecting the reception that we've had to the topic. And when I mentioned it to Tim, I thought, oh yes, this will be fine. This is related to my mahi at Community Research. And then once I started pulling it together and seeing the interest, I realized on the one hand that this is a really timely topic for me to be just sharing some reflections on, and that's the sort of korero space. I thought to start off with in terms of my positionality in this space. So in my mihi, I'm fourth generation Chinese New Zealander. My great-grandfather came here in 1896, and he came and he lived in Te Whanganui Atara. Then he actually went back and he sent his son when his son was 18, and my dad was born in Whanganui Atara as well. They lived in a fruit shop in Thorndon, in Tinakuri Road, if anyone's in the Whanganui Atara or knows Whanganui Atara. My grandmother came over with my mum when she was 8, when the Japanese invaded China as a refugee, and she was part of the 1939 cohort that the government allowed a small group of Chinese to come at that stage. And then, so I was born in Hawara. My dad's a dentist. What else can I tell you? I'm a single mum. I've been in the research social policy space for I realised that doing this webinar would make me have to admit that I'm actually quite old. So for several decades. And began in the late 80s, early 90s And when I was first there, that was when I just arrived just after the point system had come through. So I realized that my journey has actually been one of being a bit of an observer, or you call it a witness, from the pre-point system, very much immigration policy of like cultures, and read that as kind of Western-based cultures, to the point system, which opened up the diversity. And then through that, I guess the aspects of the growing mahi and journey of Te Tiriti as being acknowledged, recognised, acted upon. So my first job was at Ministry of Justice, actually, and one of the people there who had a small intern office. I forgot to close the gate for my daughter, so I'm just going to have to give Neil a minute. Um, and had Moana Jackson was there to start working on principles around Te Tiriti as a way of framing, translating, and yeah, shifting the conversation, shifting the korero. So before I go any further, what I'd quite like to do is ask you all to share a bit about your positionality and your space in relation to um, the conversation today. So from very many different places, Tangata Tiriti, different diverse communities, Malaysian Chinese Tauri queer researcher, Kia ora Nicola, Latin American academic, so different spaces, first generation here, Kia ora Hazel. Thank you everyone for that as a starting point for our conversation. And I guess one of the key things for me is to really recognise that in bringing together this webinar, just the richness and generosity and the cleverness of people who I've met along the way, who have actually shared their experiences with me, taught me, and I guess the words I was thinking about, the words, you've got good intent, and we can see your heart's in the right place, and then they have the patience to actually work with me or talk with me in the mahi that I've done. I'm just going to, probably got a question thing there, leave this one out and then carry on with the korero. Okay. So as I was saying, I just really want to acknowledge all the different people that I've worked with over the years and just their passion, commitment, and the challenge and the journey and how that has evolved over time. And in particular, I've been really privileged to have worked with different tangata whenua as within the public sector and to help support some of their mahi. And I think one of the things that actually has been said to me a few times over the years is that as a tangata tiriti of colour, there is sometimes a role that's afforded to us on both sides almost as a bridging space. So in roles that I've had, say at Superu or earlier in the Living Standards Framework mahi in different spaces, it's been that I've been the one to almost translate across the two, to champion for some of the focus on the Māori initiatives. And I've asked about that and why at times when the Māori personnel may have been pushing for something and it's been pushed back, whereas then I've gone and pushed for it as well, there's been more of a there's been more of a shift than there might have been otherwise. And that's shifted over the years. But I think there is a space that is occupied which is more appreciative of the diverse views because we're bringing a diverse view. I'm not quite sure if I worded that well. And I think what I want to talk about is some of the key things along the way that I've come across which have really resonated with me and are, if you like, touchstones for the mahi that I do. And I feel really privileged to be part of community research and have a role as the Kaito Hono Ethnic Research Engagement Lead. And community research in itself is Te Tiriti centred and led. It has co-governance, and it was formed in 2008 very much in that aspect when community research was being more recognised and different ways of doing research and tikanga Māori and te ao Māori based ways of doing research were being made more visible and getting more traction. And a key element of that was the whole whānau ora program. As part of Community Researchers Program, there's a code of practice, and that's where this rangatira-tanga slide comes from. And as part of that code of practice, which is on our website, it talks about the role of decolonisation as part of community research practice. And that relates to those whole ideas of power, privilege, whose knowledge, who has the control over how questions are framed, what questions are asked, you know, what methods there are, all of those aspects of it. The Code of Practice also talks about other elements around reciprocity. It talks about integrity, authenticity. So I've just picked up this one because it specifically focuses on that decolonisation aspect. And then one of the webinars that was held in 2016, which I really love as a sense of thinking about progression for communities and where our space is and where we are in terms of decolonising knowledge. And I think about diverse communities, not just in the cultural sense, in a really broad sense, not just about ethnicity, but about, gender orientation, sexual orientation, about different ways of knowing, being, doing, and seeing and communicating, including things like sign language. So it's about referencing the lived experience communities, if you like, that come together as cohorts. And this was presented in a 2016 webinar as a framework, and it, to me, connects up those elements of nothing about us without us, but it positions it specifically within a research space and specifically thinking about the imposition of power and the imposition of knowledge and methodology. And it talks about the shift of coming from research that's done to. So we're the experts, we know the information that needs to be gathered. And so we're going to do this research. We're going to send out a survey to the community and get them to fill it out. Research done for is a little bit more shifting towards, it's still a we know what you need and we're doing it for your benefit kind of element to it. The research with starts to shift to beginning to think about, we need to work with you because we need to sort of bring on board those elements of different ways of thinking and power sharing. So that with arrow in the middle relates to that horizontal line. So even though it's done with you, it may be there's sort of a continuity of whether that with is more Western imposed in its way of framing, or whether it's starting to shift towards more I'm going to use community rather than Indigenous here, but this was developed by Nan and Dr. Chelsea Gritfeld, specifically in the Indigenous space. But it's towards the with, where they're giving you broader ability to make decisions and to suggest how things are done. The researchers, though, even though it's a with, may not necessarily be from that community. The by starts to bring in that concept of it's being done by the community. And then at the very top is the as community. So the differential between the by is the by where the community gets to lead, right? But there's still not necessarily the control or the power to be able to make choices around methodologies and things. It's about fitting in within the system. And then the as actually is about doing that research as Māori or as that community. So the choices and the power about the methodology, the questions, the way the information is shared and the use of that information is as community. So I find that a really helpful way to think about the different ways in which power and control is situated in a research space. And it also helps to, I think, be really clear when you're doing your own mahi about, so where is this piece of work positioned? And I think one of the ways of helping to decolonize is actually stating that clarity, thinking about those things and thinking about, well, how could this change? So this webinar by Nan Wehepana and Dr. Chelsea Groupfeld is on the Community Research website, one of our past webinars, and it's a really good webinar if you're interested in watching it. And this specific framework is presented in the locus of power segment, which is about 6.5 minutes in. I think one of the things over the time when I talked to you about being old was the progression over time, where originally, much of the evaluation research mahi I was done was a piece of work that was done for 2 and 4. And then after that piece of research was finished, it would be sent to Māori reviewers to say, what are your thoughts on this? So it was an add-on at the end. And then we gradually shifted to the with and to the by, and there's and actually and as, but there's quite a lot of, as we all know, within the current context, there's quite a lot of shifting and differences in that space. So this is the locus of control power model. I also want to talk a bit about my time at Suparu, because that was really, I had quite a few aha moments in that space. And this was when I had a role leading the Families and Whānau Wellbeing Program, which is a dual knowledge stranded program, which was a dual stranded program. And Suparu subsequently got disbanded. But as part of that, we adopted, well, when I arrived, actually, Suparu had already adopted the Awawhiria Braided Rivers model. And I was really privileged to work with Professor Angus McFarlane and Shona McFarlane in working up how Suparu could utilize, well, how that we operationalized the fact that we'd said had adopted this model in our mahi. And it actually resulted in a lot of unpacking in terms of different ways in which the model was interpreted and different, I guess, risks in terms of that interpretation. So I guess one of the biggest conversations that we had was, well, if it's braided rivers, don't the two become one? Aren't you actually bringing that together? So when I arrived, the way that they were going to take next steps for this braided rivers approach was to combine the two different knowledge strands into one. And we came back with no, they're still separate knowledge strands. They never converge into one. They cross, meet, and come away again, and it's at those cross points where there's the conversation, the korero, and the sharing of ideas, and then the coming away again. And that with those sharing ideas, that's where it's about having, looking at commonalities, tensions, and differences. And then I think another conversation that we had about this model was, oh, but won't you just get caught like a possum in the spotlights? Like, which way do you go? Which one has privilege? All those kinds of things. And it's really that we need to keep in mind the common kaupapa and the context of everything that we're doing. So, hey, it's a frame of reference for a particular common kaupapa agreed across the groups that are coming together for that korero and navigating that space and conversation and sharing. I think the other aspects that came to mind is actually one of my biggest aha moments is that, so I'm fourth generation Chinese New Zealander, so through the time over the years, there's been my own work to decolonize, if you like, and to appreciate both my own culture and some of the influences in my life with that culture, but also increasingly be curious and understand and learn about te ao Māori and Māori culture, and to actually put aside in that journey working in that space. And I think some of those things along along that journey, really in realizing that it's actually quite a mind shift to go to reduce the privilege that you give the Western and science kind of based training and upbringing that I had, in terms of my education. And there was at one stage where I was drawing a diagram and I drew a life cycle based diagram, which was where the Western strand was going. And then I drew that and said, so this is what we're going to look at next, is the life course kind of approach to families. And I turned around and said, so where does the whānau strand sit with this? And that's where we had an amazing reference advisory tangata whenua group. The question, the comment came to me, you're really good of heart and you're really well intentioned, but that the different strands of knowledge. And that's when the penny dropped and I said, I've asked totally the wrong question, haven't I? And it was not where the fit was across the two knowledge strands. It was where does the Te Ao Māori stream go next, totally separate from the Western stream in its own way, as to be developed by that group and reference group and the researchers there. And I was working with Violeta Araga Kemp and Kaukuru Baker as part of the Kaimahi at Suparu. And it was really working with them and unpacking some of this mahi that I got to appreciate the distinction between, that's actually what I was talking about before, those earlier steps to get into the as step of community research and research more generally in relation to different communities. Another element of that was we brought together the Braided Rivers approach with a negotiated spaces model, which Maui Hudson and others had worked with, because we were conscious that there was the need to have conversations and understanding about who's in the room for doing that braiding. And I guess that kind of work really was focused on Te Tiriti in the sense of Māori Western science. But at this time, we started also having the conversations, well, I was having the conversations about, so where does the ethnic community space fit with this kind of framing? And actually, in the report that we wrote about bridging cultural perspectives, we recognised that the key elements around the context and framing of weaving and respecting knowledge as on an even platform sit also with having those conversations across different cultural paradigms. And so that's a possibility for thinking for the future in terms of connecting up with Western science. And I think one of the other things which I've reflected on and which I think is a really powerful tool is the need to have translation frameworks. And government has picked up some of those, like the braided Hei Awa Whiri approach government picked up on and was something that they were trying to implement in different spaces. You've probably may have heard of Te Whare Te Whā or Hei Wheke, where government has embraced, and to varying degrees, those frameworks as ways of thinking about how they work. And I think that provides opportunities for having a place at the table. Some of the work that I've done more recently has been around the family violence, sexual violence space in terms of ethnically diverse communities. And I think some of the things which are key elements across those, which I think underpin diverse community mahi, are those concepts of being strength-based. So this is from Te Arakura. There was a Te Ao Māori framing for the strategic foundation for the Te Arakura work at that time. And it focuses on that concept of a systems approach, which looks at the layers, including like at that outer layer, those economic, policy, social, and wider environmental influences and impacts. It focuses on relationship. It focuses on strengthening and healing and responding. So I think all of these set a platform which, although this was set for the family violence, sexual violence space, actually has relevance across the board, in my mind. So I'm just putting it out there that these are my reflections. And I think in terms of those frameworks, there's another one which actually relates more specifically to ethnic communities. And I don't know if people know about the integrated tree model, which Asian Family Services has developed, and which forms some of the space beneath some of the mental health. They're doing a mental health counselling kind of program pilot in Poneke, in Whanganui-o-Tara, and also the other mahi. And again, we have the systems kind of approach, but here we're starting to, because it's a diaspora-related kind of frame of reference, bring in those concepts around life before migration, uprooting, coming into the space, and some of those things which are needing to be navigated. And I think frameworks are a really powerful tool for that translation for others in government or decision makers to be able to get a sense of, oh, so here are some of the differences that we need to take into account. Here are the things we need to be aware of in terms of having these conversations. And in the family violence, sexual violence mahi that I did, I guess looking across the literature, the same kinds of aspects and components were coming through repeatedly. Whoops, I need to go onto this one. And those around the different spaces from a migrant or from a refugee perspective about needing to have trauma-informed services, about that cultural safety, about recognising the model minority kind of pressures, the transnational kind of framing that people were living within, as well as the other aspects of language, context, potential isolation, familiarity with services, all of those kinds of things were repeatedly come through in the literature. And yet it makes me ponder about the potential value of developing some more kind of frameworks to actually embed some of those concepts as part of government thinking so that we can sit at the table and have some of those conversations. Given the time, I'm going to skip this bit, but I think it was actually thinking about what sorts of frames of reference that you see or that you're curious about. And because there's like such a broad range, such as if we look at the Pacifica space, I know when I was talking to some of the Pacifica peoples in the space, it was like, it wasn't until we had the Pacifica Proud and some of those framings in the family violence, sexual violence space that we kind of felt that there was more of a, a concrete kind of shift in interaction in what we could do next, and that it was seen in a much more concrete way rather than being seen as an abstract kind of point of difference. Also, I'm really conscious of the mahi that's going on throughout the motu to bring out the concepts, both in the Pacifica space, Wha, Talanoa, there's a whole range around those sort of the different states within the Pacific as well, but also more in the broader ethnic space around Ubuntu and Guangxi and other sort of relational kind of aspects and methods and ways of doing. And so I had thought that through this we might be able to just explore some of those, but I'm just going to keep moving through. I think so there's time for questions at the end. I just want to talk a little bit more about data per se at the moment, and that's about the flattening and visibility and invisibility. And I think a stark example to me was when I was doing the family violence, sexual violence mahi, where the statistic that was in all of the kind of literature or government-based kind of literature at the time was the 15.5% you'll see there about total ethnic communities. And they were grappling with acknowledging that the voices of communities and the knowledge within communities, what there was that there is a concern around family violence, sexual violence, and that the statistics don't tell us the prevalence that is occurring, and partly for those reasons that I was talking about before. And then this statistic came through, which actually starts to unpack the 15.5%, which was always being used, which was one across all ethnic communities because of the small numbers. And it actually shows you that that 15.5% flattens, aggregates across a range from 11% to 29.9%. So, and even then, you've got 24.8%, which has flattened that whole Mila category, which we know is problematic. And I think that that voice, that collective voice, if it's having common kaupapa and common messages, can help to try and push that unpacking. I was conscious that when I sat down to write this webinar, that there were so many ideas that flooded my mind. And I'm also conscious that there will be people out there who are very knowledgeable about all of these different spaces. And so what I thought I would just do is just some touchstones as just a way of pondering or maybe creating some further thoughts for kororoa as we move along. And also if in the Q&A time peeps have got specific thoughts or knowledge or have worked in the space, can contribute to the conversation. So things I ponder about, and I guess I put these down and then I tried to ask AI to create an acronym, but no, it wasn't going to work. So I'm going to talk about these in kind of like different sorts of order. But the first is about that whole underpinning idea of relationships and connections. And within that is the relationship that ethnically diverse communities have with Te Tiriti and with Mataki Mai. And with that, I went to a workshop about a month ago around Mataki Mai, and the real focus wasn't about if any of you know about the spheres and the relation sphere, it was actually about the underpinning principles or po. And with that was that concept of inclusiveness. And the facilitator really engendered this conversation about inclusiveness, and that those conversations and relationships are needed for us to do that as Tangata Tiriti of colour. And there's amazing mahi going on by the different groups out there, from ASTA to the African for Indigenous Rights, from all sorts of spaces. I did what I wasn't going to do, because it's a real tension, because if I start mentioning groups and I don't mention all the groups, then I'm going to get myself into trouble. So I'm not going to mention too many groups, because I know there's a lot of amazing mahi and people out there. Positionality and transparency, I think, are a tool, because it relates to being really clear about the mahi that we do and our connection to that mahi, and as allies, our connection to that mahi. And I think the transparency is about naming. And that's with having an eye to where we want to go, so that when we name where we are, we can have that conversation as well. And for me, positionality is actually about not just people as individuals, but also common kaupapa and the work that we do. So in a project will have a positionality in my mind, and it relates to the diagram that we looked at before. What's the past journey for this project to be what it is? Who are the people involved, and what's the questions that are asked? And what's the future aspiration for what's going to be done with that mahi? And for us as people, it's what do I bring as lived experience? Why am I standing in this place? And which direction am I looking at for being in this space? Because that's the type of information that I'll be grabbing onto. Common kaupapa, as I mentioned before, that's what is essential, I think, in terms of any movement forward. Because yes, we're all diverse, we're all different, and if we can come together with collective voice, with a common kaupapa, that means that we'll be much more visible, and it means that we have a stronger foundation for a conversation for change. The collective voice, I remember, is one of those things in relation to especially opportunities at the moment around the next steps for modernising the census and the ethnic data classification standards. So at Community Research, we ran an a workshop around modernising the census, and I was quite surprised because some people said, well, we didn't actually realise the census was stopping. And it's because in the comms around this, they're still using the word census, but actually getting a point in time data set about everyone living in Aotearoa is no longer happening. And what that does is it means that it renders much more invisible the smaller community group populations in Aotearoa. Because the way that they're going to replace or modernise the census is to use administrative data and much smaller surveys on a rolling basis, with the idea that was put forward at the last sort of Stats NZ seminar that was given, that then they'd bring together the information over 5 years that they got from those surveys to represent the full population. But if we're talking about for ethnic communities where we've got inflows and outflows of new migrants and those leaving, then it actually is a really blurry statistic because you can't point to any one point in time where you're capturing that voice. The Canada, the UK, and Australia considered dropping their censi, and the UK actually, and they've changed their minds because they've recognised that that equity issue of being able to have a clear visibility for the smaller groups won't be able to be addressed. So in our submission, which ended up being co-signed by peeps who attended the groups and peeps who attended our workshop, the idea was, well, even if you want to go there, it's too soon to drop the census. Do a point in time census as part of progressing towards the other one so that you can just double check that you're not going to have this invisibility issue. Or another option we put forward is you take a dual track model, which is what the UK are doing, which means they're not doing the census point in time survey as often, but they're still doing it just to keep that proper benchmark for their other admin data methodologies. Having said that, the current government is pushing forward on that. But one of the things that their new model has is bespoke approaches to help gather information for those, for specific potentially marginalised communities that'll occur through the new approach. And one of those is around, I think it's the disability space, the gender diverse space, ethnic community space, and there are a couple of others which I can't remember off the top of my head. And with that, there's going to be some engagement about, so what are some of the bespoke approaches that could be taken for collecting that data for the visibility of those communities? And so there is opportunity there, which is where the opportunities words comes in, for us to be able to influence that. And I think that's where I come back to the idea of collective voice and cumulative knowledge as communities, that if we can come together with a common kaupapa, and I've capitalised the word as, because rather than responding to what Stats NZ is putting forward in the first place, if we took, say, I know this is very aspirational possibly, our whiria approach, we would actually for ourselves decide what are the classifications which would be useful to us as communities for our knowledge, for our understanding and change? And then we would go, okay, so how does that connect with that? What would need to happen for there to be value on those both sides? Related to that, though, because when we were doing the census awhiawhi, we did have a discussion about data sovereignty and equity and governance and self-determination and data use. And one of the things that came through was we could talk about it, but we don't have the infrastructure from an ethnic community's perspective to actually being able to act on it yet. That there are definitely peeps out there who have the passion commitment. But if we look at the journey that's been travelled across for Māori, for Pacifica, it's been at the point where they've been able to bring a group together and establish an infrastructure and a web page and all those kinds of things. And so those are the sorts of things that we need to think about, putting aside what language you use, putting aside the idea of is sovereignty relevant for our space within Aotearoa, or should it be data governance? Is there, because of the past histories and relationships with Aotearoa, obviously Māori as Indigenous people, but also Pacifica states having a different historical relationship over time with Aotearoa in terms of citizenship and transnational and the movements to and fro. And that's why I've got infrastructure there, because I think that's something that we could be thinking about. And I know there's some amazing collective initiatives going on, and there's really definitely, and it's about resourcing and all those sorts of things. But with that infrastructure and all of those things above is the potential for community knowledge as communities. And it builds off what I was just sort of pondering before. And it relates actually to some quite separate work that I've been doing with that I've done earlier with central regional space and with the social investment space, which was developing a common core wellbeing module which all central regions could use. And what it did was it asked the same questions. And what it means is that you can look across and bring some of that knowledge together. So are there common things from an ethnic community space which we would advocate for to be framed in the same way? And it links with the way we measure ethnicity over time for different groups, because it would mean that we could look across that knowledge much more readily. I'm going to stop there because we're at 12:56. So kia ora, and thank you so much for your time.
Kia ora, Bev. That was very informative and thought-provoking. I'm sure there are heaps of questions. In the interest of time, could we just take a few, please? Any reflections, questions? Thank you very much. You're getting a lot of hearts and thumbs ups. Reflections, thoughts, comments, questions?
Ooh.
Perhaps everyone's kind of, yeah, odd. Oh yeah. Did I? Oh yeah, that was you.
I have a question.
Yes, Emma.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, and so much to take in and think about and chew around. So I'm hoping that we will have a recording of this so that we can go over it again.
Yes, you would.
Great. That's wonderful. Thank you so much for all the work and all the knowledge. It's much appreciated.
Thank you, Emma.
So the recording would be on our Facebook page. Yes, for the members. Yeah.
And
Okay,
Community Research will also do a production copy and put that on our website as part of our webinar series.
I can just maybe share, it could be a question, but maybe a prompt as well. Like, we don't have to find answers now, but keep pondering or thinking. I mean, I have done some decolonizing epistemologies and decolonizing feminisms work. And one of the things that I often grapple with is like when we do decolonial work or thinking, we still use phrases like frameworks, tools, models, the choice of our words or our language itself, or the way, because that's the way that, I mean, the way, the moment we say frameworks, like, our mind goes and think, or conditioned, which is
Mm,
colonial,
mm,
colonized to condition, I mean, think in certain ways and be in certain ways and, like, produce knowledge in certain ways, right? So, have you come across that, Bev? Or, like, I'm sure this is a question for everyone who does similar work. Like, and if you have, like, how do you kind of hold back? And yeah, what are some of the ways
yeah,
that you're like, okay,
yeah,
let's
yeah,
take a
yeah.
step back or few steps back and revisit this. Yeah, thank you.
And I guess that's why I frame frameworks as a translating tool. So as a translating tool that explicitly acknowledges that you're doing it in a way that sits with an understanding from that colonized space, because we have to be pragmatic in that sense. So that's different from that as community element of not needing to concern yourself with that space because it's within our own paradigms. Does that kind of make sense to you? Because I see over the time, okay, so when I talked about the points, so we were in basically an assimilation kind of space. Then we actually did explore plurality. Like in the early social reports when I was there, we were asking about retention and proficiency of first languages and things like that, because it was very much wanting to create that pluralistic aspect of diverse communities. And now we've shifted, I might have been put in the too hard basket, I don't know, but now we've shifted into much more of an integration space. And so that's that in my mind, that's the central systems being controlled from the traditional kind of Western space. And if you think about on the outside of the box, there's the dots where there's the integration to allow in that concept of other knowledges, but it's still, and to foster it potentially outside of that central power and control element. But we still haven't got to the point where there's that letting go to say, as communities, you can move forward kind of stuff. The other aspect
Mm.
that actually I was going to do, which I, because of all the tech was kind of a bit problematic, was that concept of that shift from, in terms of that, how at the moment with the Matiki Mai aspect and thinking about the Te Tiriti, Kororo and journey, that concept of colonisation being, assimilation, colonisation, and then that idea of where we are now, which is kind of like an integration aspect. So it's not totally covered, but we do have, it's not at that same footing to where what we're after is actually that plurality of that same footing. And then when we think about it from that point of view of Te Tiriti and Matiki Mai, what we're doing is those two are there here. And because we've got that joint Te Tiriti based societal governance, what that does is it creates space for, in the cup of the hands, for that plurality of our different cultures and different ways of doing being seen to occur, because we've already got that plurality with the and of Te Tiriti. So that's kind of where I'm seeing things, but at the moment it's as a translation piece, the frameworks, rather than saying this is who we are, it's actually saying so you can understand who we are, here's some ways of depicting it to work from.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. It's just this really is my reflections rather than
Yeah.
yeah,
I guess. Yes.
yeah.
Sometimes I'm like, can we even do decolonial work, right? Like, can decolonization even happen? All right.
Mm.
We are over time, but then we can also decolonize time, right? All right. Anyone else? Or decolonize such frameworks, right? Seminar frameworks.
I'm very open to someone saying, You know, we realise you've got good intentions, however, and then of course,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
what I'm really
I
open to
loved,
that,
yeah.
because
I
that's
loved
only
your
ever you to
last,
be.
sorry to interrupt. I loved your last slide on relational ways or highlighting relational ways of being and meaning making. That's very helpful. Yeah. Kira for that.
Sure.
Anyone? All right. I think everyone's.
No, I just need to do
Yeah.
one thing,
Yes.
which is post a feedback form for the survey, which I forget every time we have a seminar. Oh, and I've sent it to you, Tim.
Thank you, those of you who stayed
It might be
around,
too late.
stuck around. Thank you for being here, and we will see you in our next month's seminar, which would only be, what, 2 weeks away? Yeah, something like that.
On the 24th of July, that's Asian Family Services are going to present about the integrated tree model.
We have our next
We'll
one's
do
on the
another one.
Friday, the 3rd of July.
Oh, okay. I'll have
Yeah.
So we
something
have
we do.
2 in July.
So
In fact,
watch
the
your
speaker was just here. Sorry. Yeah.
yeah
Sorry,
watch
Tim.
your inbox, everyone. But thank you for joining. I've dropped Bev's evaluation form that she shared with me in the chat. So feel free to click on that. We'll leave the meeting open for another 30 seconds or so you can click onto that. But we hope to see you in a few weeks. And thank you so much, Bev, for the time today. We really appreciate it. It was very interesting.
I might just close this with closing karakia.
Please.
Please
Are we
do.
ready for that? Kia mutu a mātou mahi mo tēnei wā. Mana kitia mai mātou katoa, o mātou hoa, o mātou whānau, aio ki te aorangi. Our work is finished for the time being. Protect us all, our friends, our family. Peace to the universe.
Maori
Kia ora
ara.
ka kite.
Kia ora, ka kite.